All right, so thank you very much for coming, and good afternoon to everyone. Over the past 200 years, wealthy elite men have written the history of Egypt's wealthy elite men. Traditionally, women have featured as a subtopic, usually a chapter about daily life, as if they were a separate group functioning outside of society. There is a need to rebalance the scale and write about women's history, and more importantly, the relationships that existed between men and women in this patriarchal society. The study of masculinity is different than men's history. It is something that is intertwined with history, economic structures, and social relations. When I began this project, I wanted to know what was the masculine ideal, the public conventions of masculinity. How could one be a man in ancient Egypt? How did men benefit by subscribing to these ideals? Also, did masculinity provide structure for the Egyptian state? How was the system enforced? How were the ideas about masculinity associated with the ancient Egyptian concept of ma'at? Ma'at reflects the ancient Egyptian ethical conceptions of truth, justice, and divine harmony. And it is embodied by the goddess who wears an ostrich plume in her headdress. Ma'at prevented chaos from overwhelming Egypt, or the world, and created balance in the universe. The study of masculinity in ancient Egypt does not have a long history. So my work should be considered as somewhat of a starting point and by no means an exhaustive study. I've built on previous Egyptologists' work. R.B. Parkinson and Greg Reeder are among the few scholars to research masculinity in ancient Egypt, and both have contributed to an essential foundation for future research. Today, I will first discuss sex role theory and how it has been applied to this study, followed by a description of Raewyn Connell's groundbreaking theory on hegemonic masculinity and its application to the ancient Egyptian wisdom texts. Next, I will present a brief summary of each wisdom text used in this study. For the remainder of the lecture, I will analyze some of the attributes that supported ancient Egyptian hegemonic masculinity among elite men. My assertion is that the ancient Egyptian wisdom texts, which are a collection of instructional material, reveal a hegemonic form of masculinity for elite Egyptians. These men may have been members of the royal family, high-placed bureaucrats, high priests, etc. And that this dominant form of masculinity was maintained by a population that adhered to the rules of Ma'at. By upholding Ma'at, the general population of Egypt was complicit in its own subordination. Yet at the same time, the wisdom texts demonstrate that alternatives to this masculine rule also existed, in the sense that some of the maxims were created as lists of prohibitions. Since it was advised that people not engage in a particular behavior, some men must have been engaging in this behavior. So, establishing a normative definition for masculinity, what men ought to be, can be understood from this set of instructional material. Sex role theory treats masculinity as a social norm for men's behavior. And in practice, it combines normative definitions with essentialist definitions. I acknowledge that many men must not have fit the hegemonic pattern of masculinity, and that there is a contradiction in referring to a hegemonic masculinity that had such high standards that were almost impossible to meet by the majority of the population, or by elite men. However, this is an acknowledged part of Connell's theory of hegemonic masculinity. Unfortunately, in sneaks the essentialist model. In ancient Egypt, the hegemonically masculine man was heterosexual. He was supposed to find a wife and set up a household. As a husband, he was to support his wife, be a good provider, and show kindness. It was important to have children, especially sons, and as a father, to act as a role model and pass on pertinent knowledge to his son as he became a man. A hegemonically masculine man was to act with humility and remain composed when dealing with others, because acting aggressively or in haste was incongruous with the prescribed norm. He was to practice moderation and avoid gluttony and greed. Honesty, compassion, and benevolence were valuable characteristics that acknowledged one's membership in the dominant male group. Respect for the gods and loyalty to the king also secured one's position of hegemony. Above all, it was essential that a man's character and behavior fall in line with the concept of ma'at. Ma'at is usually discussed in conjunction with kingship, as the king was the intermediary between the human world and the divine world. But the ideas of truth, order, balance, and harmony were to be upheld by all Egyptians. Acting against Ma'at would have had a negative result in the equilibrium of the cosmos. Ma'at ensured that the sun would continue to rise and set, that the Nile would flood annually, that Egypt would be fertile, and that the office of kingship would endure. Therefore, an elite man must ascribe to the hegemonic model so that life in Egypt could continue as normal. One can turn to the social sciences as a means to understanding masculinity and the social construction of gender. Simone de Beauvoir produced the revolutionary work, The Second Sex, where she pushed beyond the confines of psychoanalysis and established the idea of gender as an evolving interaction with circumstances and social structures. Beginning in the 1930s, scientists began to use the term sex role, and it became a technical term used in the field of social science to integrate one's place in the social structure with cultural norms. The more common way for this concept to work involves a man or woman enacting a predetermined set of behaviors. These behaviors would be categorized as either male or female and would be attached to one's sex role. These enactments would be the result of socialization. This should not be confused with biological determinism, even though these sex roles do often expound on biological sex differences. Sex role theory can be useful when looking at the ancient Egyptian wisdom texts, as these texts present prescribed behavior for elite men. Therefore, an investigation into this genre of literature can elucidate the normative definition of masculinity in ancient Egypt among elite men. These texts encourage the status quo and are not critiquing social relations. They are representations of conservative thought that support traditional gender roles, specifically the hegemonic form of masculinity. Masculinity is constructed every day through social interaction. The wisdom texts can relay the repertoire of gender practices by providing us with a list of attributes an elite man should possess to demonstrate his dominant status in ancient Egypt. While they cannot clearly show how men were actually acting, the texts are, at times, suggestive. The idea of hegemony refers to the cultural dynamic by which a group claims and sustains a leading position in social life. Hegemonic masculinity is understood as the pattern of practice that allows men's dominance over women, the arrangement of gender practice that legitimizes patriarchy. In ancient Egypt, this dominance was enforced through the implementation of ma'at. Not only did ma'at maintain a patriarchal system, but it also encouraged the authority of a small group of men over other men. These were the king's agents. It was through the leadership of this small group that the masses were subordinated. They did not have to force people to adhere to ma'at because it was ingrained in the culture that Egypt could not survive were it not for the existence of ma'at. This world made sense to the Egyptians, and ma'at was formulated in a way that warned against acting against the king, as one could risk the stability of the cosmos. In theory, hegemonic masculinity is distinguished from other masculinities, such as complicit, subordinate, and marginalized. It is enacted by only a minority of men and is considered normative. According to Raewyn Connell, it embodied the currently most honored way of being a man. Other men who experienced the benefits of patriarchy, but who did not enact the dominant version of masculinity, and complicit heterosexual women allowed the patriarchal structure to continue. These men who supported but did not actively engage in hegemony exhibited complicit masculinity. They were complicit in their own subordination because they assumed the system of Ma'at was right and reasonable. Ma'at reproduced masculine domination and gave some men the ability to enjoy authority over others. Subordinate masculinity is another category that relates to hegemonic masculinity, but is subservient to it. Gay masculinity is one example of a subordinated masculinity. Marginalized masculinity is another category that involves the intersectionality of class and race. These categories are flexible and change with the times. A hierarchy of masculinities was realized through studying the prejudice and violence experienced by homosexual men by heterosexual men. But hegemonic masculinity does not necessarily mean violence. It means supremacy, realized through culture, institutions, and persuasion. The authors of the ancient Egyptian wisdom texts were attempting to instruct their sons in a way that maintained their hegemonic position and helped them to become men. I analyzed the following wisdom text for this work: the instruction of Harjedef, the instruction of Ptahhotep, the teaching for the vizier Khagemni. A vizier is like the second in command or a vice president to the king. The teaching for Meri-Kare, the king Meri-Kare, the teaching of King Amenemhat I for his son Senwosret, the loyalist instruction from the Sehetep Ibrahistila, the instruction of a man for his son, the instruction of Amun-Nakht, the instruction of Ani, and the instruction of Amenemope. Unlike other ancient Egyptian texts, the wisdom texts were attributed to famous sages. However, it is not clear if these names are real or pseudepigrapha. As one can tell by several of these modern titles, these texts deal with the elite class of the Egyptian population. The majority of these texts has been preserved to us in copies and has remained part of the Egyptian literary tradition over centuries. In many cases, the original date of production is estimated based on the names of characters, the mention of prominent cities, certain grammatical forms, and content. Therefore, their composition dates are still speculative. The fact that many of these texts were copied and reproduced for centuries demonstrates their significance and cultural relevance. In order to limit the time frame of this study, it may be useful to look at when these texts were read, collected, and recopied, as opposed to their date of creation. With this, all but one source, namely the instruction of Harjedef, were part of the literary tradition beginning around 2000 BCE and extending to about 1000 BCE. This time period encompasses the Middle Kingdom, the Second Intermediate Period, and the New Kingdom. Although there are preserved copies of some of these texts that postdate the New Kingdom, there are no texts that are believed to have been composed post-New Kingdom. Clearly, this is a long time span, and by no means was Egyptian culture static. So, in practice, ideas of hegemonic masculinity changed too. Now I will give a brief summary of each text I reference in this paper. The earliest known example of this genre is the instruction of Prince Harjedef, who is recognized as the author of this instruction, and it was written for the prince's son, Au-Ibre. Prince Harjedef was the son of King Khufu of the 4th dynasty, the builder of the Great Pyramid. This is a short piece, and only the introductory section has been preserved, which has been put together by multiple later copies. The images presented in this brief section encourage the prince to establish a household, take a wife, and have a son. Monogamy was preferred, and it was important to have an heir to take over the estate. This work is clearly heteronormative. Heteronormativity is a set of norms that recognizes homosexuality as the opposite or the other. The instruction of Ptahhotep is the longest preserved wisdom text, containing a prologue, epilogue, and 37 maxims. There is only one complete copy of this work and 3 fragmentary copies. Ptahhotep is considered to be one of the few genuinely historical authors of a wisdom text. According to his instruction, he was a vizier who worked under King Essesi of the 5th dynasty and was on the verge of retirement and wanted to pass on his position to his son, who was also named Ptahhotep. However, this instruction seems to have been reworked substantially before the Middle Kingdom, the form in which it's preserved to us, and was recopied into the Middle Egyptian dialect. There are guidelines for the reader or listener to get ahead in life through good behavior. The maxims of Ptahhotep pick up on themes presented earlier in the instruction of Prince Harjedef. In addition to being heterosexual, being a good husband, with the added element of controlling one's wife, a good father and a good provider, this wisdom text stresses a man's need for restraint. The restraint comes in the form of calmness, do not respond in anger, prudence, do not gossip, and moderation, do not be greedy. The second major theme is modesty. Multiple passages underscore the need to be humble. A man should not upstage an important official or be arrogant about one's knowledge, and he should respect his place in the hierarchy. One should be a good listener and take advice and not pretend to be a master. What is curious about this text is that advice regarding the vizierate, meaning the position of the vizier, is conspicuously absent. More likely, this should be considered an account of the practical knowledge all upper-class Egyptian men should acquire. It is Maxim 32 in the instruction of Ptahhotep that presents the famous passage scholars use to dispute the heteronormative perspective taken on ancient Egypt. I will discuss this passage further in reference to heterosexuality and hegemonic masculinity. The teaching for the vizier Khâgemni is the third text set in an Old Kingdom context. But like the instruction of Ptahhotep, the text is preserved to us in the Middle Egyptian dialect. There is only one fragmentary copy of this work preserved, and it's on the same papyrus as the complete version of the instruction of Ptahhotep. The teaching for the vizier Khâgemni is addressed to said vizier, who served King Huni, the last king of the 3rd dynasty, and King Snefru, the first king of the 4th dynasty. Presumably, it was addressed to Khâgemni by his father. Despite an Old Kingdom setting for this text, the instruction of Prince Harjedef is still considered to be the earliest document of this genre, as the language is more archaic and its character less complex. There are 3 desirable traits noted in the teaching for the vizier Khâgemni, all of which overlap with ideas presented earlier: humility, prudence, and moderation. And there is specific reference to a man not being gluttonous or greedy. It was of utmost importance to refrain from this behavior, as it was tied into the ideas of modesty, composure, and self-control. With the next text, we move out of the Old Kingdom and into a transitional period before the Middle Kingdom. The teaching for King Mary-Kare resembles the wisdom text purportedly created during the Old Kingdom, and like the instruction of Ptahhotep, for example, it presents instruction from the point of view of an office holder passing on his knowledge to his successor. In this case, a Heracleopolitan king of the House of Keti is preparing his son, Mary-Kare, to take office. This is the earliest wisdom text dealing specifically with how to be a successful king. I've included this piece in my study because one might make the argument that masculinity moved from the top down, the king being the epitome of hegemonic masculinity. Large portions of this work, however, are irrelevant to the study, as the text instructs Mary-Kare on how to be a good king. This instruction would not have been relevant to upper-class men in that sense. In fact, there is a stark contrast between masculine traits acceptable for a king and those acceptable for the elite. For example, most texts for elite men suggest a life of humility and moderation. These sentiments are not echoed in this royal work. Nonetheless, this text definitely represents a continuation of some of the ideals presented in the earlier wisdom texts, and it is for this reason as well that I have considered this work in my study. Notions such as composure, prudence, generosity, benevolence, and knowledge all feature in the teaching for King Mary Carré. What is even more intriguing, however, is when this text remarks on the comportment of soldiers in the royal army, bravery emerges as a noble trait for non-elite men. Nowhere else is bravery considered a desirable trait. Bravery is useful for soldiers who fight, but was probably considered to be threatening when embodied by elite men close to the king. The fifth text under investigation is the teaching of King Amenemhat I for his son Senwosret. This is a rare example of a piece of literature that deals with regicide and is supposedly written by the dead king from beyond the grave. It contradicts the Egyptian ideal of a divine monarch. This work is not very useful for a study on hegemonic masculinity among the elite class. However, it does emphasize the idea of being a good father, in that the purpose of this piece is to pass on instruction to the son. This wisdom text focuses on the king's assassination and the treacherous behavior of subjects close to the king. It is suspected that this work is a piece of political propaganda, probably solicited during the reign of King Senwosret himself, to justify his rule. It is intriguing that this was a popular work in antiquity and has been preserved in many copies. Since the form of masculinity encouraged in the wisdom texts should be considered ideal or perhaps stereotypical, not all elite men would have actually possessed these qualities. The teaching of King Amenemhat I for his son Senwosret does distinguish between expectations and behavior, and as such, it is a potentially revelatory text. It is definitely an outlier with its emphasis on treachery. Since this is a royal text, it can be assumed that the majority of men involved in the conspiracy would have belonged to the elite class. But instead of being composed, patient, and showing loyalty to the king, these men disregard the rules of Maud, organize a coup, and assassinate the king. During the 12th dynasty, a scribe produced another instructional text that remained popular until the end of the New Kingdom, and that is preserved in almost 30 copies. The Loyalist instruction from the Sehetep Ibre stela is the earliest example of this text and is adapted as a teaching by Sehetep Ibre to his children. The theme of this text is to obey the king and be a good subject. Although loyalty has not been a main theme in texts previously mentioned, obedience does fall in line with the concept of humility and acknowledging one's place in the hierarchy. But it is more explicitly stated in this text. The next wisdom text, the instruction of a man for his son, also belongs to the Loyalist tradition. This is considered an instruction for every man, and in addition to encouraging obedience to the king, it offers advice on being wise, humble, prudent, and hardworking, thus reiterating the ideal masculine traits listed in the earlier wisdom texts. With the instruction of Amun-Nacht, we move into the 18th dynasty. In this fragmentary text, the scribe Amun-Nacht offers advice to his apprentice, Hor-Min. In the short excerpt that is preserved, knowledge, patience, and prudence are the valued masculine characteristics. The instruction of Ani, the penultimate text, was composed in the 18th dynasty and was written by a minor official. There are two main differences between this work and most of the others in this genre. First, the audience is middle class, which is probably to be expected as a middle class emerged during the Middle Kingdom. The topics are more commonplace than aristocratic, such as prohibitions against drinking excessively and having intercourse with strange women. Second, a new literary theme is introduced, namely that a son might not listen to his father's advice. In the epilogue, the son, the scribe Khans-Hotep, appears suspect of his father's advice. He scoffs at his father's warnings about drinking in excess, sleeping with strange women, disrespecting his parents, being a slacker, and overstepping his rank. Khans-Hotep thinks there are too many tedious rules and he resents being forced to act like his father. This passage is notable as it reveals that there were multiple ways of being a middle-class man. The son rejects the virtuous ways of his father and suggests his preference for a more lackadaisical lifestyle. Regardless, he will still reap the rewards of the patriarchal program. This is also the only piece that devotes a sizable section to honoring one's mother. Perhaps this is due to the nature of the audience. Nevertheless, many earlier ideas are repeated here. Humility, prudence, and generosity, and respecting one's place in the social hierarchy is paramount. Only a modicum of education is expected from this audience, but knowledge of the hierarchy is imperative. The last wisdom text, the instruction of Amenemope, is one of the longest preserved to us. It dates to the Ramesside period and exists in multiple copies, with the papyrus in the British Museum being virtually complete. As a main theme, this work offers a contrast between the hot-headed man and the silent man, the ideal man. In addition to other themes continued from earlier texts, honesty, prudence, calm composure, and restraint. And warnings about greed and gluttony, and gossip and slander abound. Acting as a role model for one's children is noted in several passages, furthering a theme that appears in the oldest wisdom texts. Lastly, it is advised that a man not seek out success, but that if he lives a good life, prosperity will come to him. As in the earlier instruction of Ptah-hotep, a man is not to set his heart on seeking riches, as this is considered superficial and against the prescribed social hierarchy. This instruction text also exhibits a change in the traditional values, where action and success are not emphasized like they had been in earlier texts. And the attributes of an ideal man have changed. The new hegemonic man should be content with a humble position and a lack of material goods. This change may be due to a new interpretation of God as the only perfect creation, since people were now more dependent on the divine than they had been before. There were changes that occurred at the end of the 18th dynasty and moving into the Ramesside period with regard to the royal ideology and the king's relationship to the gods. The Amarna revolution caused the Egyptians to become disillusioned with the kingship, which ushered in a more militarized form of government, discrediting the traditional model of bloodline succession. The end of the Ramesside period was a time of civil unrest, strikes, and famine, which affected the elite class. So the instruction of Amenemope provides evidence for the flexibility of hegemonic masculinity, and it demonstrates that political, economic, and social circumstances can dictate change. There are three particular attributes of hegemonic masculinity that are ubiquitous in the wisdom literature: heterosexuality, wisdom, and wealth. Each of these is inevitably connected to other attributes within the repertoire of the masculine. Men were also expected to be honest, tolerant, composed, and generous. In this version of the masculine ideal, the aspects constructed in the cultural imagination are positive. The ugly characteristics, like violence and aggression, are noticeably absent. Today, race is often a determining factor in what constitutes the masculine, but this is not apparent in the wisdom texts of ancient Egypt. Heterosexuality. From the earliest wisdom text on, an elite man was encouraged to establish a household, take a wife, and have a son. Fathers were to act as role models for their sons, and the texts advocate good parenting. The significance of having an heir to take over the estate is prominent in several texts, which implies that society was patrilineal. These works are clearly heteronormative, and they suggest that monogamy was the norm. The very nature of this genre of writing suggests the significance of fatherhood and the value of acquiring knowledge, since these texts were created to give advice from father to son or office holder to successor. And the trope of becoming a man is pervasive. Now let's return to the well-known passage in the instruction of Ptah-hotep that I mentioned earlier. Maxim 32. Do not fornicate with an effeminate boy. Be well assured that such debasement will only arouse his lust, and the desire which is in his body will not be cooled. Let darkness never come for the performance of such lewdness, so that he may be quiet after he has satisfied his desire. This passage references an effeminate man in opposition to a normal man. The reader is considered to be the normal man. As I noted, some Egyptologists cite this maxim to demonstrate that homosexuality did exist in ancient Egypt and that it was condoned. Clearly, this particular passage is suggesting that the reader should not engage in homosexual behavior, as it might encourage more of this behavior in the effeminate man. Needless to say, the inclusion of this practice in the instruction text clearly shows that some men were engaging in homosexual relations, and as such, homosexuality should be considered one form of masculinity, albeit a subordinated one. It may be interpreted that dominant elite males should not act effeminately, as they would lessen themselves through their assimilation with women. This caused a symbolic blurring with femininity. Therefore, homosexuality was not a hegemonic masculine trait for the elite class. With reference to alternative masculinities, which can be detected through the list of prohibitions in these texts, it may be useful to follow a Foucauldian method of analysis. In an attempt to repress sexual expression, discourse about marginalized sexual identities ensues. In the instruction of Ptah-hotep, an attempt is made to control homosexuality. But by writing about it, it may have actually been given a name and have been established as a category. By talking about men who did not fit the normative definition of masculinity, new categories of masculinity were created. Through discourse, an effeminate man became a reality, a category in which someone could belong. Banning something constitutes it. This implies that the ideas expressed in the wisdom text are reactive, and that change within the male role comes from elsewhere. Today in America, heterosexual men subordinate homosexual men in many areas, and they undergo discrimination in everyday experiences. These circumstances place gay men at the bottom of the gender hierarchy among men. As gayness was assimilated with femininity in ancient Egypt, a patriarchal society, gay masculinity is one example of a subordinated masculinity detectable in the ancient sources. This notion is corroborated by the depictions in the Old Kingdom tomb of Neunk-Khnum and Khnum-hotep at Saqqara. Greg Reeder has demonstrated that the positions of these men, or the positions that they occupy in the tomb decoration, are very similar to the way a husband and wife were depicted in contemporary tomb scenes. He also points out that Neunk-Khnum stands in the dominant male position on the left, while Khnum-hotep stands in the position reserved for the wife on the right, following the iconographic trends of the Old Kingdom. Reeder, among others, suggests that these two men were lovers. This is another instance of gay masculinity standing in opposition to the norm. Wisdom. Several passages in the wisdom texts suggest that education was part of the hegemonic trait list for the elite. Literacy rates were relatively low in ancient Egypt, so naturally being able to read and write was an integral part of belonging to the elite class. The following passages present this ideal. He educates the ignorant to wisdom, and those who are unloved become as those who are loved. Be proficient in speech, so that you may be strong, for the strength of a king is his tongue. Words are mightier than any struggle, and no one can outsmart him who is skilled of heart. But you will sit secure upon the throne. The wise man is a bulwark, even for officials, and those who are aware of his knowledge dare not assail him. Instruct yourself so that you may rise up as a man, and then you will equal me and none will indict you. Education directly contributed to a man's ability to gain wealth and maintain his elite status. Being literate distinguished an upper-class man from the masses. Similarly, one could function in an official capacity as part of the king's inner circle, if educated. So these same men would have had a stake in the contemporary power structure. These skills kept the bureaucracy running. Gaining wealth would also have been an incentive to subscribing to this masculine ideal, and thus ma'at. Wealth and being a good provider. Although this last characteristic might appear strange to a modern American, elite Egyptian men were not to actively seek out wealth or promotion. This notion is tied to the valued attributes of restraint and moderation. Hegemonic masculinity reinforces the power structure with the king on the top and the aristocratic class as his support system. The need to maintain one's rank is expressed in the following passages. It is not what men devise that comes to pass, but what God determines comes to pass. Live, therefore, contentedly, and let what they give come of its own accord. Do not set your heart upon seeking riches, for there is no one who can ignore destiny and fortune. Do not set your thoughts on superficial matters, for every man there is his appointed time. Do not exert yourself to seek out excess, and your allotment will prosper for you. If one turns himself about to seek out success, in a moment he destroys him. Attend to your position, be it low or high. It is not good to press forward. Step according to rank. These excerpts clearly contain religious overtones, implying that one's place in life was predestined. The social hierarchy was inexorable and not to be controlled by man. This is most likely the foundation for the desired modesty and moderation that is exalted in the wisdom texts. It was acceptable to gain wealth, but one should not try too hard. This may upset the palace bureaucracy. Hard work was beneficial, but manipulation, slander, and underhandedness to gain riches were base. I suggest one should see these passages as propaganda to uphold the royal ideology, the social hierarchy, and the patriarchy that is Ma'at. To conclude, in ancient Egypt, the hegemonically masculine man was heterosexual. As a young man, he was supposed to find a wife and set up a household. As a good husband, he was to support his wife, be a good provider, and show kindness. As this genre of literature demonstrates, being a good role model and passing on pertinent knowledge to one's son was important. A man was to act with humility, remain composed in dealing with others, practice moderation, avoid gluttony and greed, and behave honestly, compassionately, and benevolently. These characteristics acknowledged one's membership in the dominant male group. Consequently, it was essential that a man's character fall in line with the divine concept of Ma'at. Attempting to define masculinity is a difficult endeavor. Is masculinity what men do? If this were the case, we would not need the term masculine. Masculine moves beyond the biological to the manners in which men differ from each other. The wisdom texts offer a normative definition of masculinity, what men should be. In this case, the texts are referring to a particular class of men, the elite class. Nevertheless, I do believe these maxims would have circulated and exerted influence well outside the constraints or expectations of a single male authority position, like the Vizierate, for example. A positive outcome of this study is that the toxic trait list, common to many hegemonic masculinities, is not present in this version. This might be considered remarkable, as hegemonic masculinity refers to men engaging in activities that maintain gender dominance, like physical violence, aggression, risk-taking, and competitiveness. Anthropologist David D. Gilmore suggests that the cultural function of the masculine ideal is to encourage men to work. The masculine ideal pushes men into action when life is challenging. The punishment that men face is losing their identity if they do not do the required work. In the case of ancient Egypt, that work equated with being a loyal servant to the king by maintaining your place in the social hierarchy and supporting the patriarchal system. Men should work hard to preserve the palace bureaucracy that exploits the masses for the benefit of the few. The Code of Ma'at perpetuated the enduring office of kingship. So regular people upheld Ma'at by submitting to the king through obedience to his agents. With this system, a small group of Egyptian men could maintain their own distinction, prestige, wealth, status, power, and of course, secure life after death through support of the Egyptian state. Also, the wisdom texts demonstrate that hegemonic masculinity changes and adapts over time in response to different social, political, and economic stimuli, and that socioeconomic class was relevant. Although the differences are not profound, it has been postulated that the instruction of a man for his son and the instruction of Annie were oriented toward a middle-class audience, specifically because the advice offered and the prescribed behavior is distinct from the other instructional material. Therefore, the modes of behavior expressed in these two texts should be considered normative for middle-class men during the New Kingdom and those who are addressed as exhibiting complicit masculinity. I like Connell's analogy of men who cheer at a football game versus those who actually play the game, although I think the situation is often more nuanced than this. The elite class made up only a small percentage of the Egyptian populace, but the majority of men benefited from the hegemonic program. In the highly organized system of Ma'at, Egypt cannot have balance unless everyone willfully takes his place within the strict hierarchy. Middle-class men received some of the benefits of patriarchy without actually exhibiting the hegemonic attributes that were considered normative for the small elite class. However, as men, they still had an advantage over women because living according to Ma'at sustained the institutional oppression in ancient Egypt. These middle-class men, or lower-class men in the case of the soldiers in the army, have a connection to the hegemonic project, but are not taking the same risks as the elite class. Through the study of the ancient Egyptian wisdom texts, we can detect a hegemonic form of masculinity for elite Egyptian men that was maintained and reproduced by the rules of Ma'at, the ethical conceptions that prevented chaos from overwhelming the world. Thank you. There we go.
Are there any questions for Kelly?
Hattie?
Okay, so actually I have two questions, if nobody else has a question. My first question is actually about, when you were looking at the sources in particular, and this information may actually come from other sources, but I'm just curious, were women dealt with at all, or were they just sort of like dealt with as the counterpart, right? Like,
They were only dealt with in connection to men, how men should treat them, act towards them, or beware of them, or control them, or something like that.
so do you think in the wisdom text anywhere there would be like the idea of like an instruction for how women should be, or it's always sort of just this?
No, everything seemed to be as though the audience were only men. Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Statues of families showing men, great big tall men.
And my other question, and I don't know if it's sort of a question, it's just like how you sort of dealt with it. I'm wondering if you've ever found it sort of problematic taking this sort of very modern idea of, at least a modern conception of heterosexuality and homosexuality and sort of transplanting them onto the ancient world. Just, studying the ancient world myself, I know sometimes these categories get very muddy, right? Because we have this very particular idea of what heterosexuality looks like, what homosexuality looks like, these relationships, and what they are in the modern world doesn't always coincide with what that could have looked like or meant in the ancient world. And And so I was just curious about, especially your section on homosexuality in this ancient Egyptian context, if it was ever sort of problematic.
Well, we have very few references to anything that could be considered anything other than our modern conception, or that we can see in the text. So that's why I was trying to focus on the relationships between men. I don't mean in the sense in partners or anything like that, but different groups of men and how they relate to each other, and what were all the variety of ways that one could be a man or act as a man or be masculine, and is there a hierarchy? So it's obviously something that men do, some men do, so how do the wisdom texts see that? So I guess I was looking at it in a very particular context. Thanks. Anybody have any other questions? Philip?
One of the texts, I think, was about the king who had been assassinated.
Yes.
Were there any other advices for how the king should be headed? Most of the advice seems to be for his subordinates.
Well, in that particular, I didn't concentrate in the presentation on what the king should do because he's like one person. But this particular text tells him to not trust anybody, to be very careful, to keep a watch over, simply because he was betrayed. So he's telling his son to be careful, not to trust anybody, in multiple different ways and phrases, but that's the general idea.
Uneasy lies the head on the throne.
Yeah. Jean?
I wonder if there was any, you started with the Middle Kingdom or the Americas. Is there any research on, like, the age of the pyramids in the Old Kingdom, if masculinity was defined in his way, or was it just defined through these giant pyramid structures, or how they became king was envisioned, which we don't know very well because we don't have a lot of this culture.
Right. See, I only looked at the wisdom texts, but I'm sure I could do the same thing for tomb biographies or funerary literature or something like that and see, and that would be a great thing to do. I just haven't got that far yet. So,
Limiting this wisdom text, I was wondering in the big
Yeah.
picture besides the wisdom text, there must, so you're saying there's a lot out there.
there's a lot of material out there to analyze, not that necessarily has been analyzed in this respect. Yeah. Barb?
Is there anything that talks about the average person, not the elite class?
Okay. The closest we come to that is the couple of wisdom texts that have somehow were either initially addressed to a middle class audience, and these are the later ones after a middle class has emerged, because we don't always have a middle class. It's over time that we eventually get one. But only a small percentage of the population could read and write, so most of our documentation across the board, whether it be textual documentation or like artifacts and architecture, they are for the elite class. So in general, there's an imbalance in the scale as far as what we know about elites and what we know about regular people. So it would be nice to eventually, balance it out. Yuta, did you have a?
In a few cases where women took on any masculine roles, they adopt masculine behavior.
I'm about to start looking at this right now. So I have some ideas, but nothing totally confirmed. So that's actually one of the things I'm interested in.
I presume we're talking about Hatshepsut.
Yeah, that would be one example, yeah.
Like a man or
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Queen Hatshepsut, she was a ruler of ancient Egypt, and in certain contexts, she has herself depicted as a male king, or as a king, because there's no other option, really. So she has the fake beard and the kingly kilt and the crown, everything that would normally be attributed to a man, and her physique as well. It's kind of changed to look more masculine rather than feminine. So, yes. Female masculinity is a topic I'm about to embark on. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Well, I've been teaching with you for about 3 years now.
Mhm.
I never asked you, do you do this research reading hieroglyphics, or do you read translations, or both?
Well, I used to read the actual hieroglyphs, but now I do both, depending on if I have time. I can read the hieroglyphs, but I often do check other people's translations as well.
With admiration.
Yeah,
to read
thanks.
hieroglyphics. Well, thank you all.
Thank you very much.